Hello and welcome to this Forum for Philosophy event on Mary Midgley and Why She Matters. My name is Danielle Sands and I'm a fellow at the Forum and I'm going to be chairing this event. A fierce opponent of the overreach of science and a lifelong advocate of the humanities, Mary Midgley's writing ranges across animal ethics, religion, science and the natural world. In all of these areas, she appealed to a philosophy that is humble and attentive, connecting philosophical thought to lived experience. Our speakers this evening will be celebrating Midgley's life, work and legacy, and will ask what she can teach us about how to live. Let me introduce our speakers. Ellie Robson is a second-year PhD candidate in philosophy at Birkbeck, University of London. Her PhD thesis is a contemporary revival of Midgley's ethical naturalism, with a specific focus on the connections between Midgley and the work of 𝗘𝗹𝗹𝗶𝗲 𝗏. Ellie has recently published a chapter in the book 𝗘 Philosopher Queens, which tells the stories of the lives and legacies of 20 underappreciated female philosophers. Dr. Greg McElwain is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the College of Idaho. His research focuses on the intersection between animal and environmental ethics in environmental philosophy. He is the author of Mary Midgley, An Introduction, which was published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2019. Dr. Panayiota Vassilopoulou is Reader in Philosophy at the University of Liverpool. Her doctoral work focused on Plotinus' views of the soul, which was also the topic of Midgley's thesis. In addition to publishing on Neoplatonism and aesthetics, she has been at the forefront of work linking philosophical research to philosophical practice in the cultural industries and the health sector. Her recent work includes a co-edited volume, Thinking: A Philosophical History, which is forthcoming with Routledge in 2021. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. The format of the event is that we'll have a discussion between the speakers and then there'll be time for audience questions. So do put your questions in the chat. So Greg, perhaps you could start things off. Tell us why you think Midgley's work is important and why we should be reading it.
Thank you, Danielle. Well, I think we'll cover quite a few reasons why that's the case as we go along, but just a few that I'll take a stab at from the start. You mentioned how wide-ranging Midgley's work is, and I think that part of the reason for her wide-ranging emphasis is because of her position on what philosophy is and how it should be done, which is to engage a range of relevant and important topics that have significance for how we live. So over 40 years, from especially the late 70s until up to her death in 2018, she published 18 books, over 200 works overall on such topics as animals, human nature, science, the environment, sex, gender, and so on. And her contributions in each of these areas, I think on their own, are quite significant. I'm thinking in particular of her position on philosophy and what it's for, which we'll get into. And also in my area, animals and the environment was quite influential and ahead of its time in the early 1980s, bringing more of a relational and holistic approach to those areas. And it's not only that these topics are engaging and relevant, but also accessible. Her style is lively and fairly engaging. I'll say that again. And in that way, she's not speaking to just the usual philosophical crowd, but also a wider audience of those interested in relevant issues who can see kind of the importance of philosophy, not just in academia, but also in the world. And then I think last of all, which I think Ellie in particular will address, is her prominence and significance overall of her voice as a woman in philosophy, which is gaining attention, and its importance and how that's been overlooked so much over the years. So I think we'll have quite a bit to talk about in those areas.
Thanks, Greg. Ellie, I wonder if you want to jump in here. Is there anything you think that Greg has missed that we need to get to?
No, I think that was a great summary from Greg. I guess just a couple of things. That was a really good broad introduction. I think just maybe I can say something a bit more specific about how she, like her projects in philosophy. So when I kind of start reading Midgley, I think she sort of has a positive and a negative sort of, well, two positive, one positive and one negative project. She's, as Greg was saying, she's really practical and really optimistic as a philosopher, which I think is really refreshing. She's really interested in like broadening and augmenting our vision of ourselves and our place in the world. So it's like a very holistic philosophy. She's really encouraging us philosophers and her readers to draw connections between like various bodies of knowledge and to create a better and a broader understanding of human beings and our place in the world. But for Midgley, like the world is very complicated and very muddled, and she is very happy to sit in that complex muddle. Like she's unlike other philosophers in that she's not trying to simplify the world. In fact, she's very against simplifying the world, and that's her negative project. But a bit more about her positive project. She's very, her methodology, I'd say, is like one of balance. Like she's constantly saying to us, right, let's not let this sort of damaging vision become too dominant in our thinking. So yeah, her negative project is sort of resisting philosophical practices that attempt to reduce the complexity in damaging ways. Like she's not saying don't simplify anything. She's saying when it becomes too dominant and damaging, then we need to check up our thinking. So for example, she doesn't want us to like reduce human motivation down to like one basic thing. Like we're basically selfish, for example, has been used in the past. She's resisting like that sort of simplification. Yeah, so broadly, she's a philosopher who definitely has her feet like firmly on the ground. She's not what you call an armchair philosopher. She is engaging in really pressing issues of our time, which I think is something really important to why she really, really matters now. She's really going to be an important person to look out for, as we'll get onto, I'm sure. The environmental crisis, the way that we teach our children, what we teach our children about the environment and nature, and the structures that our society are based upon. Yeah, so I think she's super important for the messy, muddled world, as she would say.
Thanks, Ellie. 𝗏𝗏, is there anything you want to add at this point? What points do we need to make sure we cover in this discussion?
Well, I think, as of course Greg and Ellie already said or implied, her work is complex, but I think one distinctive characteristic is that she brings metaphysics and epistemology and ethics kind of all together into a synthesis. And this is also characteristic of the great philosophers in history, or the sort of past masters, if you like, that she herself, of course, admired, and she called volcanic phenomena. So I think she's one of these volcanic phenomena, and I think we should read her because she's really very good.
Thank you, and thanks for raising, I guess, this topic of methodology and approach, which I think we're going to come back to. I mean, is this just to come back to the point you raised about bringing together these concerns about metaphysics and ethics and epistemology? Was this unusual for thinkers writing at that time?
Well, yes, I think it was. I mean, there were, of course, some exceptions, like, some philosophers like Wittgenstein, for example, that, where she admired a lot and have made an impression. But I think mostly it was philosophers from already her past, obviously, like Plato and the classic philosophers, and, Hegel and Nietzsche and, that sort of people. But I think that generally the academic scene that Midgley was in is not so radically different from ours now. And I think this kind of scene within the worlds of academia is not really conducive to that kind of philosophical thinking. I'm not saying, of course, that there aren't exceptions to this rule. Of course there are, but generally it's not something that encourages that sort of holistic approaches.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Ellie, I mean, we seem to be witnessing increased engagement with Midgley's work at the moment, which projects like yours demonstrate. Why do you think that is?
Well, a big reason, I think, is the fact she died, sadly, 2 years ago. Definitely since her death, interest in her work has burrowed. But I think a big reason for this is in academic philosophy, the work of the In Parentheses project by Dr. 𝗘𝗹𝗹𝗶𝗲 and Rachel Wiseman has been really instrumental in like bringing public interest and academic interest into Midgley's work. So I'll tell you like a little bit about this project. They're a project set up in Durham, which basically theorize a school, a philosophical school for the first time. So Midgley is part of this school, and it's a school of 4 female philosophers. For those who aren't aware, they're Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, and Elizabeth Anscombe. And the project in Durham theorizes that these women make up a philosophical school because they're studying together in Oxford during World War II. And all the men go off to war, and these 4 women are left. And there's sort of a period in which these women flourish, and it's been described as like a golden age in women's philosophy. So I think a big reason why Midgley's work, the In Parentheses project, really has helped to sort of bring Midgley into this school, because sometimes the 3 are spoken about and Midgley is left out. A lot of the reasons that we've spoken about already is that the way that she writes quite accessibly, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, she has a very unusual philosophical career. But definitely this In Parentheses project has been really instrumental in bringing her into the quartet, or the wartime quartet as they've been coined.
And is it fair to say, do you think that her work had been sort of neglected before that?
Yeah, definitely, especially in academic philosophy. So it's funny because when you're reading Midgley, or like I'm studying her for my PhD, and I'll find her in very funny places. Like she's picked up across lots of different disciplines like ethology and animal geography and social science quite a lot as well. But she doesn't tend to be picked up as much in academic philosophy. I think she definitely has been neglected. Yeah, for many reasons, but hopefully the work of people like Greg can help to get her more into academic philosophy.
Thanks, Ellie. I mean, Greg, perhaps we'll come back to you then. Clearly, you spent a lot of time with Midgley's work, and I know speaking with her as well. Why do you think there was this historical neglect, and do you think we're really beginning to make up for that now?
Yeah, I think Ellie's touched on the main reasons for the neglect, and there is perhaps a stigma at times of engaging philosophy in a public way that maybe that's fading a bit now. I mean, I think the increase of public philosophy is probably a good thing on the whole. But as something of a kind of public intellectual, when there weren't many, she was tackling these topics in a way that perhaps, due to, again, her unorthodox career, maybe caused many to see her as shading toward, away from academic philosophy. And I think she was okay with that. I think she saw herself as a bit of an outsider. She didn't write her first book until she was nearly 60. Unlike her colleagues from the wartime quartet, she didn't go the normal kind of, Oxbridge route. She, had a family, reviewed books, produced some radio programs, and broadcast some programs, and kind of just did her own thing for a while until she decided she had some things she had to say, and she really unloaded those when they came about. But a lot of the topics that she talked about, I think they have been picked up in philosophy, but it depends on what type of philosophy we're talking about. In my area, animals and the environment, it's not necessarily the most mainstream philosophical discipline. Environmental philosophy, I think, tends to also see itself as kind of on the fringe and a bit of voices in the wilderness type of approach to things. But I do think she had a bit of an influence there on animals and the environment. And that's an area that I've been trying to draw attention to, because I think she has a lot to offer there, in addition to these other areas. But yeah, I think Ellie covered that all pretty well.
Thank you. And it seems as if one of the things she can teach us, or one of the things she can help us to think about, is the processes through which we do philosophy, and the role that philosophy plays in our thinking more broadly, in our culture more broadly. I wonder if we could turn to you, 𝗤𝗏, to start us thinking about this. So what can she tell us about how to do philosophy?
Well, just first of all, picking on the point of public philosophy that has been raised so far. I mean, I'm not very happy with that. I am happy with public philosophy. I think I am trying to do public philosophy too, but and I think it's it's really great for everybody. But I don't think it's a fair thing to say that Midgley's philosophy is a public philosophy versus sort of a proper philosophy, because the canon, what we would describe the mainstream, philosophy, it's actually a very recent thing historically. I mean, okay, it's like 100 years or so. Whereas before that, we had a whole tradition of philosophy that was very much sort of public philosophy, but that was considered to be philosophy proper. So I think that in a way, one of the things that she can teach us about philosophy is that there's not one way of doing philosophy, and certainly it's not what we are used to seeing now. And of course, that was also one of the reasons, perhaps, that she was neglected, as well as other women in other areas, not just philosophy, but artists or scientists, or because they tended not to follow this, whatever at any given point was considered the orthodox sort of way. But all in all, I think we should think that this is a great example. The first lesson we can learn is that we should have an open mind about our own discipline, what it is to think, what it is to do philosophy. So yeah, that's kind of like the starting point. But for me, the first book I ever read of Midgley was the Owl of Minerva, and I was fascinated by it, and I really liked that there was this kind of first-person perspective when she was talking about philosophy. Of course, it's a memoir.
Can you just tell us a bit about that book for those of us who might not have read it?
Yeah, this is a memoir. It's like her own sort of her autobiography, seen through her own eyes, and it tells us everything about her, her life from childhood to maturity. And the whole book starts with what she says. She says that every book should start with something that somebody feels comfortable to share, and who consider something that one considers valuable, important. So she tells us 2 anecdotes about how she first came across the word philosophy. And I don't know if people know about this, but I've always thought they were particularly funny and interesting. So the first was that when they moved to Greenford, her father was a rector there, and her father's predecessor was a guy who was considered to be philosophical. So the anecdote is that one day he was in his study, and he was just looking outside, quietly watching an elm tree, which was about to fall down, either in the direction of his house, or in the opposite direction. And Mr. Swain didn't do anything other than simply look at it, contemplated it, and the tree fell in the opposite direction. So her father said he was very philosophical. And then later on, when she was in school, she was being told off because she was not eating her vegetables. And the teacher told her that she needs to be philosophical about these matters. So Midgley allegedly asked, what is to be philosophical? And the teacher said to not to make any fuss, be quiet, and eat your vegetables, eat your cabbage. And on both occasions, she thought philosophy is like really strong magic. It can prevent you from sort of having trees falling on you, and you just eat your vegetables quietly. And I think that this sense of magic is something that characterizes her work as a whole, not of course in the sense that she sat quietly and observed the world without making any fuss. I think she made a lot of fuss, but in the sense of the attraction that somebody experiences for the subject, the wonder that is involved in philosophy, that sense of discovery and awe. And so I think what she tells us is about philosophy is that philosophy is about paradox, it's about puzzles, it's about dispelling myths, creating perhaps other myths, bridging gaps between, sort of us and the world, creating multiple world pictures. And that it is important to think about the world as it is, as important as it is to think about oneself, and the two cannot be done separately. And so all in all, I think in her last book, as Greg, I'm sure, is going to say more about, What is Philosophy For?, she finishes that book by saying that the most important thing that philosophy does is to make us think about these big questions ourselves, and think about ourselves, because if we don't do it for ourselves, there's not going to be anybody else who will do it. So yeah, that's what she taught me about philosophy.
Thank you. And over to you, Greg, about philosophy and how we should do it.
Yeah, thank you. Yoda's points are well taken there. I think maybe a shift from public to practical is a good point here to bring about then. She sees philosophy as certainly important in having this value in itself, but not necessarily being a luxury, but a necessity, and that it has influence on how we actually live. And so she, and this might be something that Ellie wants to say something more about, but she, has this analogy of philosophy as plumbing, which is pretty well known. And the idea is that there are these thought patterns that kind of underlie our lives, much like the plumbing, and typically they kind of run along, patchwork together, but we start to notice them, the plumbing and our thought patterns when things go wrong. And that typically is because how we think, again, influences how we live. And for Midgley in particular, it has ramifications in how we treat each other. So seeing things, and especially she has real issues with contract thought and this atomistic individualism. And she sees that as kind of dividing the way that, and fragmenting the way that people see their social worlds, and influences the way that people see markets and society as a whole, and also treat each other. And we'll probably return to that, but it kind of goes across the board into the way that we see animals, into the way that we see the environment, how we apply science, how we think about these things and the concepts that kind of underlie and kind of hang together here, underlie these things and hang together, how those things work. Actually, they really do matter, and it's not just an issue of pure, splicing of words to get to the technical problems underneath these things, but actually, to dig into these concepts and see what type of influence they have on our lives. And so I'll kind of push that aside for now, just to point out that what she's doing very often as well is looking at how these thought patterns give rise to, and then conversely also influenced by what she calls myths, which are these imaginative visions for how we see the world. And these mythic ways of seeing the world kind of give rise to the different arguments, the different ways of seeing the world, the ways of conversing about how we should live, that make some arguments, some ways of living seem more realistic or convincing than others. And the arguments themselves may be one thing, but what she's saying is that this whole landscape, which she likes to map, right? She says we need to map this imaginative landscape, is really where these positions are really embedded. And so she connects not just philosophy with life, but kind of the work of philosophers within these visions themselves, right? Which is a pretty important contribution. And seeing how the wider picture, how we zoom in and zoom out of the wider picture, can help us to understand kind of our whole kind of thought pattern, or ways of thinking, and how we live. But perhaps Ellie might have some other things to say.
You summed it up super well. Yeah, I think the philosophical plumbing point. So this is a book that Midgley publishes in 1997, and it's sort of a persistent theme that runs through her work, isn't it? Again, she's thinking about these myths. She's thinking about the concepts that run underneath our culture and our society. And Greg picked up on this social atomism, which I think we'll go on to talk about in a little bit. But that's a point which Midgley really wants us to pull against. She wants us to see ourselves as beings who are social beings who have bonds with others in our lives. And this, maybe going back to a point 𝗏𝗏 made earlier about the canon and the proper object of philosophy, as we'd say. In the history of philosophy, we're sort of encouraged as philosophers to work alone in isolation, as individuals, away from our family. Usually a PhD student is pictured as in the room by themselves in isolation. And perhaps the pandemic has really brought to light that this myth is quite harmful. Like, we do need to live in a society where we can depend on people around us. We are, as Midgley says, we are social animals. We need culture, we need our family, we need our friends. So bringing this back, the job of philosophy for Midgley is a shared endeavor. It's something that we need to like share our concepts. We can't just be isolated individuals pulled away. So for Midgley, maybe her domestic life sort of, I think, really contributes to her idea of what the proper object of philosophy is. So we're not isolated individuals that sit alone like Descartes she's criticizing him quite a lot, but his contribution to this canon is the idea that the mind and the world are separated. So with reasons and causes, and we are very alienated from the world. Midgley's philosophy flies in the face of that idea of us being alienated, and says, no, we are beings in the world. We're in the beings in the natural world, but beings in communities and in societies, and we really need to. This is really important for philosophy. So she has this paper, or actually it's a radio broadcast called Rings and Books, which never actually goes into print, but it's on the In Parentheses website, and I really encourage anybody to go and read it, because it's really easy to read, really like classic Midgley, very witty, very, very dry. But she's talking about the canon, the proper object of philosophy, and she talks a lot about domestic matters, and how, just as an example, women's experiences haven't been treated as the proper object of philosophy in the canon, because it's sort of seen as the debate about the fetus is the individual right of the fetus is against the mother, and they're two separate, isolated individuals, and it's never seen as two beings, or it's never seen as a mother and a child. Or Midgley kind of talks a lot about how the woman at the beginning of the pregnancy, it might be seen as an ailment, but at 5 months, 6 months, it's seen as a child. And she's sort of reflecting on the fact that this is really important for philosophy, and this sort of phenomena can't be overlooked just because the canon of philosophy wants us to separate them. So that's a very roundabout way of answering the question. But yeah, I think her view of us being situated animals is really important, as we'll get on to later on, I think.
Well, I'm jumping in for Danielle because she seems to have dropped off as our chair. I'm Beth Hannon, and I'm the director of the forum, so I'm temporarily Danielle. So that's very interesting. So I'm going to use this opportunity to turn to some of the questions from the audience that we've had so far. And I think maybe talking about how Midgley has been sidelined, this is a good point to turn to an issue raised by Martin Midgley, who is Mary's son, and she felt, he says, that she was sidelined largely because she was working outside of Oxford. I wonder what you thought about that, and maybe comparing her to someone like Honora O'Neill, who also worked quite a lot in the public realm in philosophy. Does anyone want to try and field that question?
Sorry, can you just repeat the beginning of the question? Did you say Oxford?
Sorry. Yeah, that she was maybe excluded. She's been excluded historically from mainstream discussions of academic philosophy because of her position outside of Oxford.
Yeah, so
because you have Newcastle, right?
Of course, yeah. So Midgley, just to give people a bit of context, she left Oxford after she graduated. They all went to Somerville College, and she took a bit of an unusual career path for an academic philosopher. She left and she had children, and she had a domestic life. She took care of her kids. She brought them all up before she started, as Greg said, before she started publishing. So she moved up north. She was a lecturer at Reading for a little bit, but then she lectured at Newcastle with her husband until the mid-1960s. So I would say, unlike, I've been looking at a lot of Philippa Foot recently as well, who had a much more of a typical philosopher's academic career. So she published like a steady stream of articles. She got into debates with 𝗏𝗏, who became a very, who's one of the famous philosophers around that time. So I think that definitely did contribute to her neglect, the fact that she might have spent her life further up north and stuff was going on in Oxford, which was then seen as a more prestigious place to do your philosophy degree. Yeah, I think that's definitely contributed to her neglect, but definitely shouldn't have.
Do you think that that's a problem that persists today in academic philosophy? Do you think that someone, a new Midgley, would struggle to emerge under the same kinds of conditions?
I think it's likely, I would say, especially, you know, kind of bursting into the scene at almost 60 is a great thing, but not especially common. And I think, and just to kind of add a little bit of what Ellie was saying, I think that she, speaking with her over the years, she saw what was going on at Oxford as or Oxbridge, right? It's somewhat stifling. She saw the issues that were being covered as, interesting, but very technical and increasingly narrow in relation to what she wanted to talk about. So she, while she was at Newcastle, had the opportunity to kind of pull back, focus on teaching, which she, by all accounts, seemed to really enjoy, which I think many of us can relate to now, being, with our teaching loads. Sometimes it's hard to kind of really break into some of the areas that we might be interested in. But also she was able to pursue this, especially this interest in human nature and animals, and just really delve into animal studies, ethology, in ways that weren't probably wouldn't have been open to others. And she talked about how in interactions with especially like 𝗏𝗏 Foote over the years, they would meet and talk about things, and 𝗏𝗏 would be talking about this and this and this particular, what you would call the Oxford orthodoxy, and Midgley would talk about human nature and this or that issue, and she would mention how Foote would just kind of be like, why are you talking about that? Just kind of that's not what we're doing right now. So I think it's a combination of things that led to her eventual arrival in a way that people were very receptive to. And that combination and that ability for people to get their voice out there on a topic that people see as relevant, I think is always there. And maybe there are more venues to do that now, which is a good thing in some ways, but also not in some other ways, as we probably all realize on Twitter. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's always, philosophy is hard to be heard in, period. So.
But I think there's an issue of motivation as well. I mean, what interests somebody? So I suppose that if Midgley wanted to have an academic career in the sense that we understand it now, I'm sure she would have been able, I believe she would have been able to do that. But it seems that there's always a combination between not having this motive and not achieving it at the same time, because, what was available, what was the path that she should have taken if she wanted to become an academic professor, would, I think, involve a compromise that she wasn't ready to make, because she had a different vision, a different aim to pursue, and that's not uncommon. I mean, I have been very privileged in my life to have had teachers that are exactly like Midgley, although I never met, unfortunately, Midgley herself. But my first professor in Greece, who is a very prolific author, just like Mary was, has never had a proper academic post in Greece, because he started in some way, then he saw that this was not exactly what he wanted to do in his life, and he had a very strong vision, a very strong plan of what he wanted to do in life, very similar to what Midgley did. On the other hand, I can also mention my supervisor in Liverpool, my PhD supervisor, who was very unlike Mary's PhD supervisor in terms of accessibility, Professor Stephen Clark, who has been an incredible influence on me, a source of inspiration and guide throughout my life and my academic life. And I think, there are a lot of similarities again between him and Midgley in the themes that they are examining, and also the way they're approaching those topics. But in Stephen's case, he was more male, I suppose, and more at ease with following some of the traditional routes. But this doesn't mean that he is not also a revolutionary, like she was. And the bottom line is that whatever you choose to do, if it's not part of a pre-designed path, requires a lot of exposure. Philosophy requires a lot of exposure. That's, I think she mentioned, is one of the fears of philosophers. And I think we've all experienced that, what it means to be exposed, not so much to the danger of being at fault with our arguments, but of being criticized, for our vision, for our aims, for our desires.
I would just jump in here quickly, if that's okay, just to say, I think also when we're thinking about Midgley's work, it's not a bad thing necessarily that she waited her whole life to publish. Like she says on a radio broadcast, I think, where she says, oh, I'm glad that I did wait because I didn't know what I thought before then. And so she started publishing when she was 60, and then you have this body of work, as Greg said at the very beginning, 200 books and pamphlets and leaflets and radio broadcasts, like she's on Women's Hour, she's on the Moral Maze. But it's all so holistic. Like you read Beast and Man, which she published in 1978, all the way through to What's Philosophy for 2018. And it's almost like the themes run all the way through all of her work. And I've never read a philosopher who is so consistent and holistic and has this vision of philosophy that's really unlike. She doesn't ever do any U-turns. Like you get this quite a lot in philosophy, like it happened to 𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏, where they turn around and they say, oh, I was wrong about this in the middle of their career. So you have like all Wittgenstein, early Wittgenstein, late Wittgenstein. Midgley is just very clear in what she wants. And I think that's actually a really good thing. And maybe it's not a typical philosophical career, but it's definitely to be praised.
Wonderful. And maybe we could move on from talking about her life and career to some of her actual ideas. And I'm thinking about what she wrote about the nature of the self and the role of the human. I thought maybe you could take that one, and then I'll step away.
Thank you, Beth. Sorry, everybody. I had a complete disaster with my Wi-Fi, and I'm now tethered to my phone. So fingers crossed this will hold out. What did I miss?
We solved it.
We're just going to talk about the self, I think, Midgley and the self.
Do you want to kick us off, Ellie?
I actually think that 𝗏𝗏 should kick us off with this one because this isn't my clear area of expertise, I think.
Historically, we're going to take it historically. So yeah, of course, she has a lot of things to say about the self and the world, but I want to sort of talk a little bit about her first steps that I came to know fairly recently. And this is, when she started doing her PhD that you mentioned on Plotinus, which she never finished. It was in 1947, I think. And she stayed in Oxford about a year, and she did some work there. And I also did my PhD on Plotinus and his Doctrine of the Soul. And so when I met Rachel Wiseman, who is my colleague and mutual friend, she told Mary about it. And then Midgley agreed to hand over to me the archive. She had like a box with everything she had done during that year. And so Rachel came to my office like bearing gifts. And later on I met also David Midgley, who was very kind and sort of gave me some insight into that material and how Midgley related to it. Because I have to say the question that was on my mind, basically, when that was given to me was, why read it? And are we allowed to do anything with it? A kind of student work that she never published herself, although she published so many other things. And more interestingly, she never returned to that work. I don't think she ever read Plotinus ever again. I was able to find only 2 references to Plotinus in her whole corpus. And in fact, the second one is only an indirect reference to somebody else who comments on Plotinus. So it is
I think that tells us everything we need to know about the process of doing a PhD and how traumatic it can be.
Yeah, I think from the point of view of philosophy we're talking about before, it's very interesting because it shows you that there are so many paths in life and you can develop in so many different ways. Whereas kids, even my daughter's age, she's 13, feel that they have to have a trajectory like from primary school all the way to, I don't know, retirement. And it's like the same linear kind of process, but the mind and our life doesn't develop in those ways. So it's interesting to see that. But also I think it's also interesting to see whether, she mentioned at some point that she had in one of her interviews that in her life, there were a lot of missed opportunities, and her study on Plotinus was one of those. So I wanted to really see whether it was a missed opportunity, or whether, despite evidence to the contrary, it found its way within her development and her work, perhaps not consciously, but and I think it has. You know, there are a lot of, she respected Plotinus very much. She considers him a very important philosopher that should be read. And I think reading the material that exists, there is a lot of notes, but there are also 4 extensive essays, all of which deal with the self, one way or another. And I think that this is, in retrospect, one could recognize in these writings the beginnings of a lot of theories and views that she fully developed and articulated much later. For example, the idea of the unity between the human being, the self, and the world. How we deal with conflicts, like conflicts, the mind and body sort of opposition, or between perception or emotion and reason. You know, these very big sort of dichotomies and conflicts that we experience usually as happening outside of us. She credits Plotinus with this move of transposing these debates into the self in a way much more radical than Plato did before him. And she sees in Plotinus the beginnings of the inner world and what it would mean to see things from sort of inside out, as it were. And I think that's a very important thing that one could detect in her reading of Plotinus. And then it's also very important for Plotinian studies, because of course, when Midgley started working on Plotinus, there was no translation of Plotinus into English. There were a few French, perhaps, translations, but primarily she was working from the ancient Greek text. It was a very hip, exotic subject to work on. But strangely enough, that was the case 25 years later that I started. Well, we had more translations, but it was still considered to be a very marginal topic. So it is interesting to see how Midgley's interpretation of Plotinus is actually interpretation very much informed by her own view. And it may not be as scholarly or rigid as it was expected, like for the PhD. But now that we know Midgley as a philosopher, we may appreciate this interpretation, which is to a certain extent also a misinterpretation, but that's how history of philosophy develops, through misunderstandings sometimes. But it is very important because it is a way of approaching Plotinus and finding out what is important to see. I mean, she's not just putting forward a new interpretation, but a better interpretation in the sense that it's telling us something that she's tried to tell us even so early on. So sorry, this took a bit of time, but it's really fascinating for me. I've never done it before, to look through somebody's notes and reconstruct everything from this tiny bit.
Thanks, 𝗚𝗏. I wonder whether Ellie and Greg want to pick up on this as well, in terms of the way that these ideas then feed into her later work on the self and the role of the self within the world more generally. Greg?
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of process a little bit of that, because this is again new. This is new stuff. So I'd be curious to see and hear more about that at some point. The thing that stands out when you think of Midgley and her notion of like humans as animals, and this very kind of integrated approach and her continuity with nature, and she tends to be very, in just her wider position of kind of a more agnostic approach to things in general as far as the universe goes. I mean, Plotinus isn't the first thing I think, at least with the very little that I know of Plotinus, it's not the first thing I think of, but I see those connections with like the notion of unity, the oneness, right? I mean, I don't know if that's along the lines of where she's taking that in a different way than how Plotinus did it, and I don't know the technical details there, but the way that she's, I mean, others have talked, even Russell, and at some point in later years talked about kind of this notion of integration and how we become fragmented and disintegrated, and how one of the real motives that we have is some type of effort to bring together all these various aspects of ourselves into some type of unity, and it's never final. It's kind of messy, and it's really kind of painful process in a lot of ways, but we do kind of need something like that, and it contributes to our views on morality and how that developed and things like that. So I can see that, and also that connection of humans with with not just animals but larger collectives, including like the biosphere as a whole. And I can see how a notion like Gaia might fit in here with that unity, right? There's kind of this notion of a larger collective in which everything makes sense, in which everything is part of, that she was really drawn to. And so that's interesting to kind of hear some of those potential connections there. And we might cycle back around to some of those, but I do see some interesting things there that I'd love to, yeah, like I said, say for another time.
Ellie?
I'm possibly similar area of expertise as with Greg, where I'm not 100% clear on Plotinus, but I can say a bit about the idea of unity in the self and how it relates to how her views on non-human animals. So as anyone familiar with Midgley would know, her very famous beginning to Beast and Man is that we're not just rather like animals, we are animals. And though this might seem like a really simple thing to say, or like really uncontroversial, in the history of philosophy, she's pulling against the view that humans are sort of in this imperial isolated position with this amazing thing called reason. So I think Midgley's view of the integrated self is really good in just bringing that view of the amazing thing called reason that sets us apart from nature just really into context. So Midgley looks at our ability to integrate as non-human animals. So we have all these conflicting motives, and our ability to reason just makes this conflict worse, because we can see all these different conflicting motives, conflicting desires. We can't decide what to do. We can't decide when to go to the shop. We can't decide when to finish work, whatever, all these sort of things. We have conflicting desires. So the notion of integration is basically this natural desire, this natural norm that human beings have to, as Greg says, have like a continuous self, have a integrated self. And this is not just in intelligent mammals such as human beings, it's in other intelligent mammals that we share the biosphere with. So this like need for an integrated self, like we're not the only ones that suffer from conflict. And I think this notion of the self, yeah, really brings humans and non-human animals on like a level playing field, which for Midgley is really important for how she starts off her whole, I would argue her whole philosophical outlook might start from the premise of we are animals. We are not just, we are non-human animals. We're not just like them. We are structurally similar to them. We share instincts. She has this amazing theory of instincts, which I don't think has been looked at properly, but she has this, I think that again is a really important structure, which can bring human beings back down to earth.
Thanks. And just to follow up on that, Ellie, can you tell us a little bit more about her views on reason and the role of reason?
Yeah, absolutely. So for Midgley, she looks a lot in this middle chapter of Beast and Man, which I think is the core of that book, on being human as well as rational, aptly named, on being human, on being animal as well as rational even. So here she kind of brings reason and feeling, which in the history of philosophy have been kind of put into dichotomy, put into contrast with one another, especially through thinkers like Kant, who just wants us to be purely rational beings. So Midgley claims that feeling educates and informs our decisions and our actions and our thoughts just as much as reason does. So although we have this thing called reason for Midgley, we need to look at all the other faculties which make our form of life as human beings. So reason isn't looked in like glorious isolation from all the other faculties that we have. And yeah, she wants to basically look at us as as human beings, she wants to study us as animals of like absorbing interest, just like any other animal. And this ability of us to reason is just one of our other faculties amongst lots of other. She still claims it's important. She doesn't want to say to us like reason's not important. Obviously it's important, but it's sort of more of a tool of us to organize our motives and our thoughts and feelings.
Thanks, Ellie. And perhaps we...
Oh.
Sorry, I'm muted. Perhaps we can come back to you, Greg. And you said that, you know, the work that Midgley was doing about non-human life in the 80s sort of preceded this big turn in sort of environmental thought and animal studies that we've seen in the last sort of 10, 15 years. Can you give us a sense of what she was saying and doing that felt so provocative and challenging at the time?
Yes. So, you know, in the early 80s, we're coming out of this period where there's the kind of burgeoning interest in environmental and animal ethics, you know, and you have a range of perspectives there, ranging from ecological holism, kind of on one side, looking at things in these broad collectives, and on the other side, a more typically individualist approach, rights-based approach, utilitarian approaches that focus on things like sentience and interests and the intrinsic value of animals and things like this. And then on the other end, the holist side, looking at things like the value of ecosystems and the relations of individuals to the wholes and how species and things like this matter. So there's a lot going on, but it's kind of a bit disjointed, and there seem to be some various camps, but especially in the animals camp, when most of the emphasis is on things like distinctions between rights and interests. Midgley, you know, looks at this and sees that all as important and part of the picture. But in her famous book, Animals and Why They Matter, she's trying to put more context onto why animals matter in a more expansive way. And yes, the attention on the value of animals in this kind of utilitarian and rights-based approach is important, but what it's leaving out is what she thinks some of the most important aspects of why animals matter, which is that they're part of our community. They're part of something like a mixed human-animal community that has arisen in the same context, the same kind of natural context. And so when she talks about things like the mixed community, it's kind of this larger sense of human-animal continuity with nature, and how we have always lived amongst animals. Our languages, our language, our concepts, our values have kind of have risen, but also have kind of developed their content in the context of these mixed human-animal communities. So, and this can be pretty broad and abstract in the sense that we've always lived amongst animals, and that can kind of point toward that continuity with animals as a whole, but also it can kind of boil down and zoom into more concrete communities in which humans have always lived in close relations, not just in an abstract sense, but even emotive, emotional relationships with animals, much like we've lived with other humans. And so what she does is draw attention to animal subjectivity, their social lives, their relations with each other, but also our relations with them, and how if we think of community as something, especially human community, as something important, as entailing sets of obligations and claims that arise amongst a community, we should probably also be thinking about animals as part of that community as well. And once you start going down that road, you can also go a couple more steps and see how we're kind of part of this larger natural community, this life community. And that's where, you know, she'll invoke things like Gaia. And so this kind of relational thread, this kind of relational and holistic thread that she has early in the 80s, really, some see that as tying together kind of the dual interests that are developing at the time in animals and the environment, and kind of this kind of comprehensive approach that she has of seeing us in this kind of these communities of importance. And, you know, I don't want to bog it down too much and get too technical there. But then she starts to then, I don't want to to go too far, but she talks about how claims on behalf of various entities, both animals, individual animals, but also collectives, can actually coalesce when we think in these more relational and communitarian approaches, which shifts things from looking like purely utilitarian or rights-based approaches to perhaps a more, she thinks, more pragmatic and pluralistic approach to how values are worked out and adjudicated within communities. And people notice this, and then perhaps in better and worse ways, and then things kind of went a different direction. And I think recently it's come back around that this emphasis that has been taken up by ecofeminists and care ethicists, approaching things like subjectivity, relationality, empathy and sympathy toward others has become recognized as really important in seeing why animals matter in context, rather than this very abstract sense of like, bearers of rights or something like this. So I think I'll leave it like that, because it might get a little too inside baseball there, but I get pretty excited about it. Just leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Greg. I want to ask a sort of related but slightly separate question, which is about science. And clearly what you're saying is that part of her discussion of these issues of animal subjectivity, human-animal relations, and also environmental thought more broadly did engage with scientific material. Can you say, perhaps you or perhaps Ellie, say a little bit more about her use of the sciences and her perceptions, I guess, of the limitations of the sciences as well?
Sorry,
go on,
Greg.
Okay. You got it.
I can go broadly. So yeah, Midgley has a lot of philosophy of science. Ian James Kidd writes about this quite a lot in one of the great collections of essays called Science and the Self. But I will try and do justice to what he says. Essentially, Midgley, she is not against science. She claims that we need science, that science can inform us, but science needs to be used in the right way. And she basically claims that science, to some extent in the 20th century, has been used as a religion. It's seen as something people ascribe too much truth to, or not too much truth, but too much weight to the scientific opinion. And it has become maybe one of these myths, which we spoke about a little bit at the beginning. Mary's philosophy has a lot to do, she might be called a myth buster, where she claims that when an idea becomes overgrown or damaging, we need to use philosophy to kind of pull it back and remind ourselves that it's not the be all and end all. So essentially her view of science is that sometimes scientism, she calls it, becomes overbearing and pernicious to our thinking. So Midgley's philosophy, if I can just say, maybe slightly a little bit off topic, but she, I think she's an ethical naturalist, and she doesn't just want to be a scientific naturalist, which is basically the view that we can explain all of morals and all of normativity through the strictly modern sciences, so physics, biology, and chemistry. Midgley wants to claim that we can explain natural norms, we can explain morality through many more sciences, not just the strict sciences, which that's what her criticism is against. She claims we can draw, again, on lots of different disciplines, and we should draw on different disciplines. She's a big ethologist, so she really wants us to look into, I mean, Beast and Man is full of these amazing examples, like almost reading off David Attenborough's script. Like, she's incredible as she describes these animal life. She's all embedded in that. Yeah, so she's claiming that we need to draw on lots of different disciplines, and we can't just have science dominating everything. So she wants to draw, especially as well, really interestingly, on poetry, which maybe we can go on to in a little bit, but that's a really important part of her philosophy, is that we should look at the arts of poetry, literature, and that can inform our worldview and our way that we look at things. And that can give us different ways of looking at reality, like science for Midgley is just one window into what she calls the aquarium. She has this, again, a lasting analogy that goes through quite a lot of her books, where she claims that we just have one way of looking at the world. And if we only look at it through one window, we only see one small part of the aquarium, but we need to walk around and look at the aquarium from the other side. We might see some different fish or a shark in a different place and get a different perspective. So essentially she's saying that science is a good thing and is a way of discovering the world, and it's good. Empirical science is important. She is an empirical and an Aristotelian, like she's a biologist, but she wants us to claim that that there's lots of different ways of seeing the world. I think her point about art and poetry is really interesting. Maybe we can talk about that more in a bit, but this is another way of us seeing reality. We have a limited perspective, and that's just our place as human beings, as biological creatures. And poetry and art allow us to see perspectives of different people or different stories or different ways of viewing the world. And so, yes, that's a very long way of answering your question, but science is one perspective and one that is important and contributes, but one that shouldn't overtake all the other perspectives.
Thanks very much, Ellie. I wondered if you wanted to pick up on this, 𝗬𝗏, the role that kind of narratives play in determining our worldviews.
Yeah, I was thinking, as I think Craig mentioned, the Gaia hypothesis in the context of her view about animals and the environment. And you know, it always surprises me how generations, our generation, of course, come up with some ideas and we think they're new, and they're not that new. I mean, so the Gaia hypothesis, i.e. the view that the world, sort of the living beings and the inanimate beings are part of a single whole, a self-regulating whole, that also, you know, the human being is not sort of on the summit, the top of a pyramid, of hierarchical pyramid, but is very much part of that system and has a moral obligation towards the world, is not something that came up in that context. I mean, it's a very old idea, starting from Plato's Timaeus, and then going on to the Stoics, and then to Plotinus and various others. And so it's about thinking that the world is alive. And Midgley characteristically starts her PhD sort of discussions from the microcosm, macrocosm metaphor, which also touches upon exactly your question, Danielle, how this kind of metaphorical narratives, quasi-scientific, quasi sort of poetry, are exactly the place where one can start exercising one's imagination and sort of seeing things, as Ellie said, from different perspectives. So within the macrocosm, microcosm sort of analogy, what is strange is that each part of this macro world is also a world in itself. So, you know, Plotinus would say that each one of us as a human being is a small universe, but we are part of a universe as well. So anyway, this has interesting also political kind of connotations, if you like, but for the purposes of ecology and our place in the world, I think it's a very interesting exercise to see how these two relate. And if you really make, say, each part of a whole also a whole, and also give that part, which is a human being, a moral duty towards the whole and the bigger whole, then I think you start seeing the importance of you know, ecology and sort of animal rights and all these things within that context. And I think it's very important to do that in Midgley, but more generally. So I think, yeah, that's a very good metaphor. Not a myth, as Ellie mentioned, sort of a dangerous myth, but it's a very good image to meditate on.
Thanks, 𝗬𝗏. I want to fit in some audience questions now. I know you've had some already, but we've got lots of interesting ones. It's a question from Verity Burt about Midgley's kind of current influence on things, on scholarship and new materialism, for example. So things like Donna Haraway, Jane Bennett. I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about ideas of entanglement and relationality. Do you want to maybe comment, Greg or Ellie, on that influence at all?
I can say a little bit. I mean, I see it. I know there's been, I think this might be one of the areas where I've spoken at conferences or whatever, and people have cycled back around to the question that came up earlier of, you know, why do we not hear more about Midgley in certain fields? Because she seems to have her fingerprints all over some of these areas. As I was mentioning, still kind of coming down from that animal question a minute ago, got pretty excited about that. But that in particular, right, the animal area and other areas where, yeah, there are more a movement, pushing away from kind of more liberal individualist approaches towards more relational approaches. and how that might manifest in different fields, especially as I mentioned, ecofeminism and care ethics, but also others. And I think you will often see, references to Midgley. You'll see often not dwelling, but she's on people's radars, I think, very often in these areas. I think her influence is there and can probably be seen, and you see her featuring in the work of, let's say, someone like 𝗘𝗹𝗹𝗶𝗲 𝗦𝗍𝗀𝗀, and you'll see just the appropriate, kind of nod here and there, but perhaps not in an especially heavy way. So I think she's there. I think she's, and you can hear echoes of Midgley. And sometimes you're reading something and you flip to the bibliography or the notes and you're like, is there a Midgley reference here? Because this sounds a lot like her. But you don't see it as much as you might think. So maybe Ellie, I don't know, might have something to say about
that. I think I can definitely empathize with what you say with thinking that you're reading Midgley and you're not reading Midgley. I think it happens a lot with environmental discussions. I was listening to the radio on Monday, and it was Sir Tim Scatt, I think, from the Eden Project, and he was talking about how the need for a natural history GCSE and how we need to get children out into environments. And some of the sentences he was saying were just so unbelievably like Midgleyan. I even went and Googled him and checked if he had done any philosophy or any of that kind of thing, because it just really sounded like him, like her even. So yeah, I think undercurrents of her thought do come up. But again, maybe this is what the importance of a webinar like this is, to say her philosophy is really important, not just in other areas of philosophy, but also practically in politics, in the way that we think about society and the way that we educate our children, and the importance of the natural world. Again, speaking about the Gaia, like Jota was saying, and I think a comment's gone on here from David Mitchell talking about how the Gaia is a myth that Midgley wants. But it's an important myth, a myth that we need to maybe tell our children and the next generation coming through. We need to have more of a sort of Midgleyan outlook on the environment, I think.
Thanks, Ellie. I have another question from Eric L. Peterson about criticisms of holistic philosophy of biology. So one of the criticisms of holistic philosophy is the idea that it tries to smuggle in a more or less traditional religious sentiment. Is there a way to defend Midgley from this charge of sort of crypto-religious philosophy?
I can try to tackle that. I've talked to Midgley about this, and she has always, she's been favorable toward more organicist visions of nature because they're direct counters to this more mechanistic Cartesian view. And she sees a whole range of probably allied attempts to bring about organic visions as being useful. And the Gaia one, I think, is one that was ready at hand, right? It's just kind of there, it's vivid. It touches on all the features of what makes myths significant. And so it is a counter myth, right? Versus more atomistic, mechanistic approach. But she sees it as a myth, or something along these lines. A useful myth, she's used the terminology of a useful myth, which sounds a bit like Plato, right? But she herself is, she doesn't see it as something to be worshipped or personified, and she thinks that much of the resistance to Gaia is often, there are reasons, and she understands that. She sees some of the resistance being kind of gendered, some of the language just along those lines, but also the personification and the perception that this isn't in step with some scientific pictures of the way that systems work, but is more so a religious personification or something along those lines. And she does resist that. She resists the personification and the dramatization that can come from that type of vision. So, I mean, I think she can be defended in those ways, in the sense that that's not what she's trying to smuggle in. She's not religious in that sense. She sees it as, again, a countervailing myth, as opposed to a some type of unifying religious force. But if it can in some way bring about better action, better treatment of the way that we interact with the world, I think she sees that as a positive thing. But that again is how it is fulfilling a role rather than being elevated to something as a religious thing to be, again, idolized, worship, praised, personified. And that goes across the board for religions, as she's regularly noted as fairly agnostic in her position overall towards religion.
Thanks, Greg. We've had lots of questions about crisis. So questions about Midgley's work and the ways it might speak to the current climate crisis, the degradation of the environment. There's another question about COVID-19 and what it tells us about human nature and our relationships with animals and the environment. Perhaps we could kind of group those together. How can her work help us to respond to some of these moments of crisis that we're experiencing? So Ellie or 𝗏𝗏?
I can tackle the environment question. Midgley is an environmental philosopher. She's really ahead of her time there in this. In one of her books, she uses the phrase, the bad news is our house is on fire, which has obviously become like a really famous, global, renowned theme that Greta Thunberg talks about. But Midgley's philosophy is really important, her environmental philosophy. I have a quote here from her, actually. This is in her book, Science and Poetry. She claims, "We did not expect the earth to be vulnerable, capable of health or sickness, wholeless nor injury. But it turns out that we were wrong. The earth is now unmistakably sick." So I think Midgley's environmental philosophy, and as I was saying earlier about how we teach our children about how to treat the environment, this also links into the COVID-19 crisis. Like, it's been quite a phenomenon that people who have gardens, people who have balconies are much better well off, and much are coping really better than people who don't. Like, people are seeking the environment, they're seeking green spaces. And this has been something that has really been brought to light by the pandemic because we've had this curtailed, we've been forced to stay inside, we've not been able to go outside. So Midgley talks about the idea of having like awe and reverence for the natural world, but this isn't in like a romantic way. Like, obviously the pandemic's been awful, and it's easy for us to sit here and say, oh, we should have awe for the natural world. But I don't think this is such a like hippie romantic notion. Like, I think she's sort of saying that we need to place ourselves back into the natural world, and again, get rid of this like this myth. It feeds back into the idea of this myth of the atomized individual. We need to put ourselves back into the natural world, because the worrying thing is, like, if the next generation comes through and they feel themselves being alien from the natural world, there's no way we're going to solve the environmental crisis. So this Gaia myth is a useful myth, as Greg says, and it's something that definitely the pandemic has brought to light. Yeah.
Thank you. 𝗏𝗏, I wondered if you wanted to come in and talk a little bit about Midgley's use in times of crisis.
Well, obviously there is an environmental crisis that is getting really very serious, and we really need to do something about that. But I think that what we should understand is that the environmental crisis, again, in the context of what we were saying before, is not just something happening to the environment, which is sort of out there, but it is also an intellectual crisis that we are experiencing. And I don't think that it is possible to find any solution or any treatment to the environmental crisis if we don't address it also in the context of our intellectual crisis, because the two things go together, and that which unites them is morality. So, at moments of crisis, as Ellie mentioned very, very early on in the discussion, like, the COVID pandemic we're experiencing, we sort of reappreciate primarily value. And I think these ideas that are central in the Gaia hypothesis, but more generally into sort of Midgley's work and her stand, her take on evolution, for example, is that ideas like cooperation and love and friendship and altruism are very, very important. And they are not in competition to evolution, but they are very important parts of it.
Thanks, Jutta. I think that's a really positive way to finish. I can see it's 19:14. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get through everybody's questions. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us. Do come in 2 weeks when we are talking about philosophy and science fiction. Thank you. Bye-bye.